All right, so there were some problems on this quiz, and this is not something that I'll routinely do, I don't think, but I thought it would be a good exercise to go through some of the questions that were missed more often. This is not the order of questions that were on the quiz. It's also not all the questions. It's just the ones that I thought were missed more frequently and also were important. So starting with the first question I have here, suppose that I earn $250,000, I spend $230,000, and I save $20,000. What would happen with that $20,000 that I saved? It depends on whether we're dealing with Keynes or classical economists. When it came to Keynes, he believed that money saved was not necessarily lent out. In fact, it was never all lent out. If you recall from the video, the logic of that is banks hold money in their vaults. So if banks are holding some money in their vaults, that means that if you save money, some of it will not be loaned out. So the answer to that one is B. And that's really critical to understand. That explains why Keynes cares so much about consumption, because he believes if people start saving their money, there won't be as much spending, and that will hurt the economy. Alternatively, so very similar question, this now just asks the same question in regards to classical economists. Classical economists believe that all money saved would be loaned out and spent. So the answer to this one is A. Essentially what that's getting at there is the idea of Say's law, that money is always spent regardless of whether you spend it or you save it, in which case someone else borrows it and spends it. So that's a big difference between classical and Keynesian economics. Number 3, consider the Keynesian model of the economy. Currently, unemployment rate is 4.1%. If aggregate demand increases, what will happen to real GDP? Honestly, I was kind of surprised how much trouble people had on these, but when a lot of people have trouble, that just tells me it's something I'm going to have to be more diligent about in the future when I teach this class, and it's definitely something I want to make sure that we have for the exam. So the key for this question is to make sure you draw a graph. If you just try to kind of just get after this question, answer it without really spending much time on it, you're going to have trouble. You need to draw it. And sometimes for an online class, that's a problem because I'm not requiring you to draw graphs because I have no way to grade them, but you need to draw them anyway. It just makes it a lot easier. So this is how you should draw this question. With an unemployment rate of 4.1%, that means that we are at maximum GDP. Remember that the maximum GDP, or in other words, the natural real GDP, is reached when the unemployment rate is 4.5% or lower. So that means our aggregate demand curve must look like that. So if aggregate demand increases, the result will be no change in real GDP. The real GDP is already maxed out, so it cannot increase any further. The only thing that happens is prices will rise. And I know we went over that in the video, but maybe the mistake there for students was just not drawing it out themselves. You've got to be very careful about what that unemployment rate is for a question like this. That determines what the answer ultimately will be. The next question involves the same graph. It says, what happens to CPI? And the CPI would go up. So I can show this on the graph, but also you can think about it logically. Imagine a restaurant that is completely full. There are no more seats. There are no more what Keynes called idle resources. Every resource is being used. If more customers show up to the business, they can't produce more. They cannot make more food. They cannot sell more items. They are already at maximum capacity. But if there is an increase in demand and they are already at capacity, they can raise their prices. And that is what you see here with CPI going up. So that's what you should have there for 3 and 4. Number 5, now it asks if unemployment rate is 6.5%. Okay, now with unemployment at 6.5%, sorry that I'm not drawing this better. I'm trying to hold my phone with one hand here. But with unemployment rate at 6.5%, that now means the economy is not at full production. It is not at the natural real GDP. The production in the economy is below that amount. So maybe it looks like that. This is our current real GDP. This is what our economy is actually producing, and this is what it's capable of producing. You'd have to draw this to get it correct. if aggregate demand increases, what will happen to CPI? This is admittedly a hard question, but you need to be prepared to see more of these in the future. If aggregate demand shifts a bit like that, CPI does not change. We're still in that flat portion. But if aggregate demand increases further, CPI would go up. So the answer to this one is CPI could increase or stay the same, which is D. And that might seem kind of like a silly question. Maybe it seems like I'm, asking one that's a little overly complex, but this is a really important thing to understand. If the government increases spending to try to stimulate the economy, one way to know if that stimulation has gone too far is if prices start to rise. So understanding this relationship between prices and real GDP is really critical for this class. Number 6, draw the markets for loanable funds. Assume that banks are choosing to hold some of the money saved in their vaults. Based on this information, what do we know must be true? Got to be honest, this shouldn't have been a hard one. This is one that was drawn out in the video directly. So if they're choosing to hold some in their vaults, let's see what that would look like. This would be the quantity of loanable funds. This is interest rates, savings curve, the borrowing curve. And so the savings curve shows the relationship of savers in regards to interest rates. When interest rates are higher, they save more. The borrowing curve, shows that when interest rates are lower, people borrow more. This is really just supply and demand in regards to the market for loanable funds. So in this question, it says if banks are holding money. Well, if banks are holding money, what that means is money that people are saving is not all being borrowed. In other words, if I take $100,000 to the bank, maybe only $60,000 of that is being borrowed. So the graph might look something like that. All right, more saving than there is borrowing. Notice the interest rate corresponds to a borrowing amount of $60,000, and that same interest rate corresponds to a saving amount of $100,000. So that right there would be the surplus in money saved. And truth be told, this is really how the market operates in today's modern economy. The only way this market could operate at equilibrium is if every dollar saved is borrowed. That would mean banks have no money. They would have already loaned it all out. We know that that's not the case. We know that banks hold money in their reserves, so it must look like this. So the answer to this question here is that the market must operate with a surplus, A. Number 7 says Ford is one of the many manufacturers of automobiles. Right now, the market operates in a surplus. If prices suddenly rise while the supply and demand curves remain fixed, then Ford will sell either more or fewer automobiles. Most of the content from this quiz should have been a review of macroeconomics concepts. Certainly this one should have been. So for a question like this, all you're using is basic supply and demand, which is something you should be pretty comfortable in using at this point. This is supply, this is demand, and the question says, right now, the market operates at a surplus. That means that we must be up here. Again, this is supposed to be a review of concepts you've seen in the past. Some of the Keynes and classical stuff, maybe not so much, but certainly supply and demand and surpluses is something you should have already seen in macroeconomics, microeconomics, and probably all the way back in high school. So for a question like this is where we are to begin. Quantity supplied and quantity demanded. This is how much Ford is producing. This is how much the consumers are willing to buy. So they'd only be able to sell that amount because they can only sell what people are willing to purchase. If they raise the price even higher, then that will cause Ford to try to make more vehicles, but the consumers will be willing to buy fewer than they were before. So there should be a reduction in how much they are able to sell. The answer should be B. Flipping over to question 8, it says, based on how banks operate in the real world, we can assume that Say's law is invalid. Again, we know that banks have to hold money in reserves. The only way Say's law works is if the market for loanable funds is at equilibrium. That means every dollar saved is borrowed. We know that is not true. Therefore, Say's law has to be invalid. In the video, I thought I spelled that one out pretty clearly, so I'm hoping you got that one right. This one here was kind of a tricky one. Again, this is concepts you should have seen in macroeconomics. Consider a labor market below that operates with 160 people employed and an unemployment rate of 20%. So this is a little bit tricky because the formula for unemployment rate is the number unemployed divided by the number unemployed plus the number employed. Or in other words, the unemployment rate is the number unemployed divided by the labor force, okay? That's the labor force right there. The labor force is everyone unemployed and everyone employed, okay? So what's kind of difficult about this question is if you start trying to fill in the variables, what you would have is the unemployment rate is 20%, okay? And technically this is all times 100 just because we're going to turn this into a percent. So if we use 20% here on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, we know that unemployment rate is what we're solving for, so I'll just call that U. And we know that the number employed is 160. And so that's what we have there for our formula. Okay, that's where we stand. So what you need to do now is factor this out to solve for U, the number unemployed. You could do that mathematically. I showed that in the answers posted to the quiz. Or you could use the old guess and check method. That would work too, okay? So if you use the guess and check method, what you should find is the only answer that would work would be 40, okay? If the number unemployed is 40, then we would get 40 divided by 40 plus 160 times 100. That would give us 40 divided by 200, which is 20%. That's the only answer that would work, okay? So you had to be a little bit clever in setting that up, but on a question like this, on a quiz where you have no time limit, always go back and check your math, all right? A lot of y'all answered 32, which I could understand why you would have that mistake. I think what you did there is you took 32 divided by 160, but you needed to take the number unemployed divided by the labor force. So if you knew how this formula was set up, you could always plug these variables back in, run them through the equation, and make sure it comes out correctly. But again, that was a pretty hard one. Just be careful on those types of questions in the future. And then finally, these you guys did fine on, but I do want to go over them real quick just to make sure we understand. It says the government places a $20 minimum wage on this market. How many will be unemployed? This was discussed, I think, pretty clearly in the video. If the minimum wage is below the equilibrium, it will be non-binding, which means it will do nothing. This is like saying, hey, you have to pay engineers at least $5,000 a year. All engineers already get paid more than $5,000 a year. So that minimum wage literally does nothing on that market. The same here. The market naturally will have a wage of $35. So if the government goes in and says, you got to pay everybody at least $20 an hour, nobody cares. They're already getting paid more than $25 an hour, okay? So on a question like this, equilibrium occurs if possible, okay? In fact, it even says so up here in the information at the top of the page. So this would be a non-binding minimum wage. How many workers would be unemployed? 0, because we would be at equilibrium. Equilibrium means everyone that wants to work is able to find a job. That's not likely for an entire economy, but it is practical for individual markets. For example, the markets for professors that want to be accountants basically has no unemployment. Everyone with a PhD in accounting has a job. That market is at equilibrium. Number 11 here, the final one I'm going to go over, says the government places a $45 minimum wage on this market. How many people will be unemployed? So now, $45 minimum wage, which I'll draw here, that means the equilibrium now is no longer an option. The free market would like to pay workers $35 an hour. That is illegal. So the market's going to get as close as it can to that amount. And that means the market will operate with a $45 wage. So what would happen is at a $45 wage, there would be 132 people that are supplying labor. That would be the number of workers looking for jobs. Okay, remember the labor supply is the workers. That's the people selling their labor. So 132 people would be willing to work. Businesses don't need that many workers though. They demand only 87 workers. So that would be the number of jobs available. So 132 workers trying to find a job, only 87 jobs available. That means the difference right there, the 45 workers between would not be able to find a job. So the answer there is C. All right, I hope that helped. What's tough about this class is it goes so quick. This was a lot to do in just one lesson, but we have to cover the entire class in 4 weeks. This was one of 10 quizzes. This was 10% of our content for this class. So we got to move quickly. So make sure that you are reviewing your answers, going back through the worksheets, and doing everything you can to stay up to date with the class.